Amen. Cool deal. You know you're doing something right when Satan is attacking all the people around you. That may sound antithetical to the way you want to think or believe, but the point is, as long as you're walking with Jesus, as long as you're walking with God, then you're doing everything in your power to keep him at bay, because God guarantees those that walk with him that he puts a hedge about them and protects them at all times, just like he did Job. Well, when the people around you are not following Jesus in the same way you are, well, guess who he's going to attack? He's going to try to get to you through other people, through your job, if you have a job, if you have other associations that are out there, through clubs or anything else, it doesn't make any difference. Satan is going to attack them to try to get to you in one way or another. And so right now, we're seeing a big increase of activity from Satan as far as him attacking people in many different ways. He's tried to attack me in my life, and he finds it to be a very fruitless endeavor, so he usually tries to go then out and find other people to get to cause me harm in some way. Well, it doesn't work. And I think Satan has finally figured out that it doesn't make any difference what happens to the people around me. I'm still going to serve God. Amen. I'm still going to walk with God. And that's what we're here for, is just to make his day really bad, so that every day when we wake up, he goes, oh God, they are awake. So, picking up from last week, continuing with the extension of church to Rome. Now we've got the ministry in Jerusalem, where Paul is right now. And the events that transpire in Jerusalem when Paul visits the city is, on this occasion, proves crucial in spreading the gospel to Rome. We continue the church's expansion to the uttermost parts of the earth, where in last session, Paul goes through Macedonia and Greece, building up the saints with the word of God. In the city of Troas, Paul stays to break bread on the first day of the week. He preached until midnight, when there was an incident with a young man by the name of Eutychus. He had fallen asleep and out the window from the third story. Paul embraced this young man and brought him back from the dead before carrying on his preaching until dawn. So when you hear people in there complaining because the pastor's carrying on for about an hour, you need to remind them that the early churches, they were staying from, preaching until midnight and sometimes even until daybreak, because everybody was anxious to hear what the Word of God has for them. Paul calls for all the Ephesian elders and speaks to them about carrying on with all that God had intended for the church. He charges them with all of his teachings and how they should live in the sight of God. Paul gives them a masterful overview of what it is to be a true shepherd and leader in God's church. Paul then journeys back to Jerusalem so he can be there for the Pentecost celebration before he starts his journey to Rome. However, many Jews in Jerusalem knew Paul, and when they saw him, had him arrested on many trumped-up charges. And now we finally get to the part about where he speaks in his defense, where we kind of dropped off last week. Picking up from the end of Acts 21, the story of Paul's arrest at the temple in Jerusalem and subsequent request to address the crowd. Permission was granted, and as Paul stood there, flanked by Roman soldiers, he quieted the crowd by motioning with his hand. The silence was as great as the uproar it had been. He was now ready to give his testimony to the Jerusalem Jews. Men, brothers, and fathers, hear you my defense now to you. And when they heard that he spoke in the Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more silent. In other words, all the Jews, when they heard him speaking in Hebrew, oh, well, this is a Hebrew brother. So they all quieted down to hear what he had to say. Paul addresses his audience warmly and respectfully in the same terms as Stephen had used. Using their language has the desired effect. The Jews paid even closer attention. And he said, I am verily a man, a Jew born in Tarsus in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God as you are this day. If you remember Gamaliel, he was one of the men that had talked to the people in the Sanhedrin saying, you need to be careful about going after this Jesus, because if Jesus is just another heretic, then it will die off just like it has in all other times in the past. But if Jesus is doing this under God's wing, then there isn't anything that you can do to stop it. So Gamaliel was talked about in Acts chapter 5. He emphasized his orthodox background and education under the most respected Jewish teacher of his day, Gamaliel. Paul's point in citing his background was to show his hearers that he is just as zealous for his Jewish heritage as any of them. And I persecuted this way to the death. Talking about the way. And I persecuted the way to the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women, as also the high priest does bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom also I received letters to the brothers. In other words, when they gave him letters when he went out to these different synagogues to find anybody that was practicing Christianity, those were the ones he was going after. And went to Damascus to bring them which were there bound to Jerusalem to be punished. His zeal for God was clear in that he persecuted Christians to death. And it came to pass as I made my journey, now he's speaking about what all he went through as he made his journey to Damascus. As I made my journey and was come near to Damascus about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me. And I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why persecute you me? And I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you persecute. And they that were with me saw indeed the light and were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spoke to me. Paul emphasizes features that are especially significant to his audience. Paul stresses that his encounter with God was an event that God initiated. It was not something that Paul or others had sought. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Arise and go into Damascus, and there it shall be told of you all things which are appointed for you to do. And when I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of them that were with me, I came into Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, having a good report of all the Jews which dwelt there, came to me and stood and said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And the same hour I looked up upon him. Paul sought to sway his hearers with the fact that a pious Jew had communicated God's mission to him. In other words, there was more people involved in this than just me. And he said, The God of our fathers has chosen you, that you should know his will, and see that just one. And the just one talked about here is the righteous one and Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, and should hear the voice of his mouth. For you shall be his witness to all men, both Jew and Gentile, of what you have seen and heard. And now why tarry you? Arise and be baptized, and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. It's better interpreted, in other words, why wait? Arise, be baptized, wash away all your sins by calling on the name of the Lord. And it came to pass that when I was come again to Jerusalem, even while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance, and saw him saying to me, make haste. God told him, make haste, and get you quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me. God had already searched all the hearts. And he said, you need to get out of Jerusalem. They are not going to receive you. And I said, Lord, they know that I imprisoned and beat in every synagogue them that believed on you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by and consenting to his death, and kept the raiment, the cloaks of them that slew him. Jerusalem was God's original intended place of witness, and the temple had been his place of revelation, where he revealed everything. The reason Paul needed to leave Jerusalem is that the Jews there would not accept his testimony about Jesus, even though Paul had formerly persecuted Jesus' disciples. And he said to me, God said to him, depart, for I will send you far from here to the Gentiles. In other words, Gentiles who have no relationship to Judaism. And they gave him audience to this word. And what that means is they listened to him until he said this about the Gentiles, and said, away with such from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. Now they're angry. And as they cried out and cast off their clothes and threw dust into the air. That's a strange way of showing that you're angry, but they threw dust in the air, took off their clothes, started swirling them around. Up to this point, the Jews had been listening to Paul quietly, but his mention of going to the Gentiles with the gospel aroused insane jealousy and hatred. Chanting furiously in wild disorder, they cried out for Paul's life. So why did they do this? They don't like the Gentiles, is for sure. While the Jews are crushed by foreign powers and occupation troops, they take comfort in their belief that when the Messiah does come, because they don't believe Jesus was the Messiah, when the Messiah does come, the Gentiles will be struck down and the Jew will stand with his foot on their neck. That is what most of these Jews believed. That when the true Messiah shows up, he's going to be a mighty warrior that's going to whoop all of them, and they're going to stand with their foot on the foot on the neck is a term that means that they will all be under their foot. At this time, the fires smolder that will break out in the Jewish wars, ending in the destruction of Jerusalem itself in 70 A.D. When Paul claims their God has sent him to the Gentiles, they explode into frenzied rage. That's more than they can take. They strip off their clothes and wave them in the air, throwing dust up in the air as a symbol of their rage. Their national prejudices lashed into fury at the mention of a mission to the Gentiles. They would speedily have done to him as they had done to Stephen, but for the presence and protection of the Roman officer. The chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle and bade, or commanded that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him. He could not tolerate the riot, so he decided to get the truth from Paul. Whether the commander understood a word Paul said to the people, since it was in Hebrew, he could see from their actions that they considered him to be a dangerous man. It had long been a common practice to torture prisoners to make them tell the truth. And as they bound him with thongs, and what the bounding with the thongs means is that they literally were stretching him forth, getting him ready to scourge. Paul said to the centurion that stood by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned?" Roman law protects Roman citizens from the scourge, Latin flagellum, before they went on trial, and even if they are guilty. When the centurion heard, when he heard what Paul had said, he went and told the chief captain, saying, "Take heed what you do, for this man is a Roman." In other words, he's warning his boss, saying, this guy is a Roman, and of course the captain knows that's not a good thing for him. Then the chief captain came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" He said, "Yes." And the chief captain answered, "With a great sum obtained I this freedom." In other words, he purchased his freedom. And Paul said, "But I was freeborn." Born citizens enjoyed greater respect than Romans who had bought their citizenship. During the reign of Emperor Claudius, it was possible to obtain Roman citizenship for a high price. Then straightway they departed from him. In other words, all the soldiers depart from him which should have examined him. And the chief captain also was afraid, after he knew that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him, which means that he broke the law. He had broken the law by binding Paul with chains. Of course, Paul didn't bother to let them know at that point that he was a Roman. On the morrow, because he would have known with the certainty wherefore he was accused of the Jews, I'll explain this a little better in a second, he loosed him from his bands, his chains, and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. In other words, he commanded the Sanhedrin to leave their temple and come over to the castle, and there they would judge him. The commander released Paul from his chains, but kept him in custody. He decided that the Sanhedrin might discover why the Jews were accusing Paul, since he is unable to get a clear answer. He ordered this body to meet to examine Paul because he, as a commander, is responsible for keeping peace in Jerusalem. If Paul's offenses proved insignificant, Claudius Lysias, that's the name of the commander, would release him. If the Jews charged him with some religious crime, the Sanhedrin could try him. But if they charged him with a civil crime, the Roman provincial governor would try him. So they have all different ways of trying a person. Paul now speaks in his defense. And Paul, earnestly beholding the council, said, "Men and brothers, I have lived in all good conscience before God until," which means even to this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth. What he said didn't please Ananias. This is not the Annas of Acts 4:7, but the son of Nebuchadnezzar, whom Herod appointed the high priest. So he's not the same Ananias that was before, that Jesus was before. He flares up in anger when Paul claims to have a clear conscience about all that he had done. Then Paul said to him, "God shall smite you, whited wall. For sit you to judge me after the law and command me to be smitten contrary to the law?" Jewish law considered a person innocent until proved guilty. But Ananias punished Paul before he has been charged, much less tried and found guilty. Paul is indignant at this mockery of justice. A whitewashed wall is one that is inferior on the inside but looks good on the outside. In other words, it's all cleaned up and looks pretty. Whitewashed wall means hypocrite. Paul reacted indignantly and uttered a prophecy of Ananias' judgment that God did fulfill later. Ananias will be dragged from a sewer where he hides himself during an uprising and is killed by armed terrorists in 66 AD. So be careful who you're judging unfairly. And they that stood by said, "Revile you God's high priest?" Then said Paul, "I knew not, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written that you shall not speak evil of the ruler of your people. Since the high priest can only wear his distinctive robes in temple service, Nothing here identifies him, and Paul may never have seen this high priest before. But when Paul perceived that the one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Men, brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Of the hope and resurrection of the dead am I called into question." In other words, they're trying me about the resurrection. Paul recognized that he could not get a fair trial in a court that did not even observe the law it purported to defend. So he changed his tactic. He decided to divide the jury and began his defense again. This time he took the offensive. It is the teaching about raising from death that made the Sadducees so angry against the gospel. And when he had said so, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the multitude was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit. But the Pharisees confess both, showing that only two classes of doctrine peculiar to the Sadducees, and not three, are meant: the resurrection, and two, the existence of spirits, whether they be angels or souls of men. And there arose a great cry, and the scribes of the Pharisees part arose and strove. In other words, they started shouting, saying, "We find no evil in this man. But if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God." They were just trying to smack the Sadducees. The diversion is successful. The Pharisees' hatred of the Sadducees is greater than their hatred of Christianity. Their emotional dispute excludes any possibility now of a serious examination of Paul's conduct or even a clarification of the charges against him. The Pharisees likewise defend Paul's claim to having received a vision on the Damascus road or in the temple, but the Sadducees continued to repudiate it. And when there arose a great dissension, the chief captain, fearing lest Paul should have been pulled in pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and to take him by force from among them and bring into the castle again. The commander must have thrown up his hands in dismay. For a second time now he cannot discover what Paul had done and why so many Jews hated him. Claudius Lysias decided to take Paul into protective custody in the fortress. And the night following, in other words, that night, the Lord stood by him. What an honor. The Lord stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer, Paul. For as you have testified of me in Jerusalem, so must you bear witness also in Rome." So in other words, he said, be of good cheer. They're not going to be able to do anything to you because you're going to be my witness in Rome. Paul needed it. He was a prisoner. Even the Jerusalem church suspected him. His own race wanted to kill him. Twice in 2 days' time, he had escaped death. And when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. And they were more than 40 which had made this conspiracy. So they had all conspired together that one way or another, we're going to kill Paul. And they came to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a great curse, that we will eat nothing until we have slain Paul. Now therefore you with the council signify to the chief captain that he bring him down to you tomorrow, as though you would inquire something more perfectly." In other words, to get some kind of a clarification concerning him. "And we are ever," meaning before he come near, "are ready to kill him." In other words, they're ready now, before he even comes down. Assassins planned to kill him somewhere on the streets between the Fortress of Antonia and the hall of the Sanhedrin. These buildings are not far apart. They surely realized that Paul's Roman guards might kill some of their number in the process. The oath is not so suicidal as it may seem, since provisions are made by the rabbis for releasing participants from the consequences of failure to carry out their purpose if external circumstances had made it possible. It kind of negates even making an oath if you've got a way out of it. And when Paul's sister's son, why did you say nephew? And when Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait, he went and entered into the castle and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Bring this young man to the chief captain, for he has a certain thing to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the chief captain and said, "Paul, the prisoner, called me to him and prayed me to bring this young man to you who has something to say to you." Then the chief captain took him by the hand and went aside privately and asked, "What is that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to desire you that you would bring down Paul tomorrow into the council, as though they would inquire somewhat of him more perfectly." In other words, get some kind of clarification from him. "But do not you yield to them, for there lie in wait for him of them more than 40 men, which have bound themselves with an oath that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now are they ready, looking for a promise from you." So the chief captain let the young man depart and charged him, "Tell no man that you have shown me these things." The commander took the advice of Paul's nephew seriously. He probably knew Ananias well enough to know that the high priest would go along with this assassination plot. And now they'll be sending him to see Felix, the governor. And he called to him 2 centurions, saying, "Make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 70, that's 70, and spearmen 200 at the 3rd hour of the night." What's the 3rd hour of the night? 9 p.m. And he called to him those 2 centurions. Centurions, of course, each have 100 men under them, but they're taking 470 men. The commander also realized that Paul's enemies in Jerusalem would stop at nothing to see him dead. As long as Paul was in Jerusalem, there was a danger of rioting. Consequently, Claudius prepared to send him to the Roman provincial capital with a heavy guard under cover of night. 470 soldiers, the size of the escort, is not excessive in view of the troubled times and Jewish fanaticism. And provide them that they may set Paul on and bring him safe to Felix the governor. And he wrote a letter after this manner: "Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greeting. This man was taken of the Jews and should have been killed of them. Then I came with an army and rescued him." I don't believe that's exactly how it happened. "Having understood that he was a Roman." They didn't rescue him, they came down and arrested him. "And when I would have known the cause wherefore they accused him, I brought him forth into their council, whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law, but to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or of bonds." Of course, he leaves out the part that he put him in bonds. "And when it was told me how that the Jews laid wait for the man, I sent straightway to you and gave commandment to his accusers also to say before you what they had against him. Farewell." So in other words, I'm taking my problem and moving it down the road. Of particular importance is that in Lysias' judgment, Paul was not guilty of any crime, but his case only involved disputes over Jewish theology. This was another judgment favoring not only Paul but Christianity by a Roman official. Every Roman magistrate before whom Paul appears declare him innocent. Undoubtedly, Claudius Lysias told the Jewish leaders to go to Caesarea after Paul had left Jerusalem. A historical note about the Roman governor, Felix. He enjoyed a meteoric rise from slavery. One of the only ones ever recorded that a slave actually rose up to become a governor in the Roman Empire. He had a meteoric rise from slavery to a position of political prominence in the Roman Empire. He is grossly immoral, which of course fit him right in with the Romans, the husband of 3 royal ladies. While in office, he fell in love with Drusilla, who was married to Azizus, king of Emesa. According to Josephus, which is the historian, a marriage was arranged through Simon, sorcerer from Cyprus. He was a cruel despot, evidenced by the fact that he arranged the assassination of a high priest named Jonathan, who criticized his rule. It was this Felix before whom Paul is to appear. Then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. On the morrow they left the horsemen to go with him and return to the castle. In other words, the 70 horsemen would go on with him to Caesarea, while the 400 returned back to the castle. The Roman soldiers escorted Paul through the Judean hill country and the foothills to the town of Antipatris, about 37 miles northwest of Jerusalem. The remaining 28 miles to Caesarea lay over flat terrain in an area that has a meager Jewish population, so they saw that there was no danger there. That's the reason why they sent the remainder of the soldiers back. Paul's party traveled this area in daylight. The foot soldiers returned to Jerusalem from Antipatris, and the 70 remaining cavalry soldiers escorted Paul the rest of the way to Caesarea. Paul's departure from Jerusalem has now begun the first leg of his journey to Rome. God used Paul as his witness in Jerusalem again and preserved him to witness to the uttermost part of the earth. Who, when they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle, the letter, to the governor, presented Paul also before him. And when the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was. And when he understood that he was of Cilicia, he said, "I will hear you," said he, "when your accusers are also come." So in other words, he's not going to hear him until the accusers are there as well. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. Felix inquired concerning Paul's home province for the following reason. If Paul had come from an area in the empire that had its own ruler in addition to a Roman governor, that local authority had a right to witness the proceedings. Cilicia was not such a place, however, so Felix could deal with Paul himself. He needed to hear the testimony of Paul's accusers, of course. Consequently, Felix kept Paul in the governor's palace, the praetorium which Herod the Great had built, until those Jews arrived and he could conduct a hearing. The governor's palace has cells for prisoners. Paul would have been fairly comfortable there since he was a Roman citizen who had not been charged formally with any crime. So it went by pretty quick. Do we have any questions now, though, or any comments over what we have covered?
The man who wrote the letter, he was trying to make himself look good.
Oh yeah. He built himself up as the hero. I saved this Roman from a riot, so he was doing everything to make himself look good, and I'm sure he knew that Paul wasn't going to tattle on him and let them, well, he had me in bonds. Paul's just not that way. All right? So no comments, no questions over what we've covered. All right, let's take communion then.